So my special guest this morning joins me from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. He is an associate professor in the Department of Politics, History and International Relations, and his new book, The Doraleh Disputes Infrastructure Politics in the Global South, was published by the Proudly Macmillan Company, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Dr. Benjamin, good morning and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm very much happy to have you. I'm sure that it's a wonderful morning there in Malaysia. This side, obviously, it's nighttime. We are probably supposed to go to sleep, but you know, I'm happy to have you on the show and happy to discuss this new publication. So, for starters, I would just want to, to give you this opportunity to break down the core ideas of your book. What are these Doraleh disputes and what's the story behind?
Well, thanks very much. Good morning or good evening. Thanks very much for making the time for me and for proposing the interview. So I think there are four key ideas behind the book. The first one, so obviously the book is, as a prelude, I suppose, is about legal disputes over the ownership of the Doraleh Container Terminal, which is a container terminal based in Djibouti, a small enclave microstate in East Africa, but which is situated in a very important node along the maritime trade routes connecting Asia, the Middle East, Gulf region, East Africa and its hinterland, and Europe. This is actually a kind of long-standing dispute involving, on the one hand, the Dubai Ports World Company, which is an Emirati company which originally helped finance, build, and manage the Doraleh Container Terminal, with the Republic of Djibouti, which is run by Ismail Omar Guelleh, who's been in power in Djibouti since the 1990s. What made this dispute, which to be honest was not too dissimilar to other disputes over ownership or contractual disputes pertaining to rights and sovereignty and so on and so forth, what makes this a little bit special in a way is that since 2012, the Chinese state-owned company, China Port Merchants, indirectly became a minority shareholder in the Doraleh Container Terminal because it purchased the Republic of Djibouti's share for $185 million US. And I mean, I'll elaborate upon this as we go along through this interview. But this really blew up in 2018 because Dubai Ports World decided to take China Port Merchants to court in Hong Kong, in front of the Hong Kong High Court, in order to settle its ongoing disputes with the Republic of Djibouti, but also with China Port Merchants over the ownership and the management of the Doraleh Container Terminal. So from this dispute, or these many disputes, sorry, my aim is really to cover four aspects. And I mean, it really is kind of I suppose, a legal study at heart, but there's interesting political considerations to take from this as well. The first element would be, how does this fit in to this narrative being pushed that China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, is pursuing its grand strategy. And its grand strategy would be that states in the global south, and particularly those on the African continent, some who already are, under the cosh of kind of legacy debt or debt hangovers from the post-colonial period, are going to find themselves in a situation where they are under Chinese influence because they owe so much debt. So this is the whole debt trap narrative, which has largely come out of Washington under the previous administration, targeting China. So my aim was really to try and understand, whether this is a reality or is this a myth in the context of this particular case, because the theory which has been put forward by Dubai Ports World's lawyers and also by other commentators is that the Republic of Djibouti has basically been under the influence of China port merchants and has been acting on their behalf and has slowly tried to drive Dubai Ports World out of the Doraleh Container Terminal and then ultimately hand it over to China port merchants. So they would be in charge. Now they already have their own projects in Djibouti, notably the Doraleh Multipurpose Port and the Djibouti International Free Trade Zone. So if they could get control over the Doraleh Container Terminal, they would have a virtual monopoly over maritime infrastructure in Djibouti. So that's the first reason to explore this case, is to understand, does the Chinese government actually have a role? Was it the main instigator behind all of this? And actually, the findings don't necessarily support that, but I'm sure we can elaborate further as we move forward in the interview. The second point was to understand a bit better what is modern day South-South cooperation. Now, South-South cooperation is a long-standing initiative dating back to the 1950s, involving countries which were either newly independent or third world countries who did not want to take part in the rivalry pitting the West against the Soviet Union. And that concept of South-South cooperation has evolved over time. It's evolved into something which has become more business-like, more pragmatic, and led, most importantly, by emerging middle powers or middle-income countries whose own economic trajectories have kind of provided a blueprint for development. So I wanted to study through this case study, through the Doraleh disputes, how the United Arab Emirates development model compares and contrasts with that of China, which is basically being implemented through the Belt and Road Initiative in Djibouti, and to seek to understand how they interact, because South-South cooperation is often portrayed as a very benign or very positive sum game between the members of the Global South. But the reality sometimes is a little bit more inclined towards highlighting how leaders in the Global South are actually very protective of their own national interests. So here we have a case of Emirati national interests versus Chinese national interests in a Global South country in Djibouti. This leads me on to my third interest in this study, which is to better fathom how the so-called local recipients, the states themselves where these projects take place. So in this instance, Djibouti, what is Djibouti's role? Because it's often portrayed that Djibouti, because it's a microstate, a country of roughly about 1 million inhabitants, with non-existent armed forces. In fact, Djibouti's security is basically underpinned by security arrangements with its former colonial power, the French. A country heavily indebted to China and to others. The assumption is always that Djibouti is passive, it's being manipulated by others. But in fact, scholars who've looked into Djibouti's role in either negotiating Belt and Road Initiative projects or even negotiating the presence of foreign militaries in Djibouti, that the US, France, Japan, and most recently China, will tell you that in fact, the local political agency of the leadership is quite acute, that Gele and his advisors are actually very experienced and quite adept at playing off powers against one another and getting the best deal for Djibouti. So my role was really to look into, my interest was really to look into the role of the Djibouti leadership, to highlight the fact that we cannot ignore local political agency. And my final axis of research on the Doraleh disputes is to then translate what is essentially an issue of development, so international development, because it's about Djibouti's modernization, it's about trying to increase the standards of living in Djibouti as a whole. My attempt was also to try and figure out what were the geopolitical ramifications, whether we can assume, particularly in China's case, that its economic heft, that Chinese investments in Djibouti are roughly around more than $14 billion US. It's the biggest investor in Djibouti by far. Whether that translates into China having geopolitical influence vis-a-vis Djibouti, but also with regards to the rest of the Horn of Africa, and perhaps even more further afield into the Gulf region, because the Gulf's security dynamics in a way are tied to what's going on in the Horn of Africa. And my findings here, because again, there's often this portrayal that through the Belt and Road Initiative, coming back to my first point, is allowing China to become, a prospective hegemon in the making. Well, actually, when you look at the specifics, Chinese investments haven't necessarily resulted in a growth in its geopolitical influence, either in Djibouti or in the region. And actually, it's the UAE, the Emiratis, who've made, it seems, more impactful use of their economic statecraft in Djibouti and in the region to push a specific political aim, which was, in this case, to get as many allies as possible in the context of the civil war in Yemen, which is literally a stone throw from Djibouti. So that was the fourth and final purpose of my book, is to kind of bring in that geopolitical dimension and see how it connects back to international development.
Mm-hmm. That is wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So now, why is China taking control of this Djibouti's Doraleh Container Terminal?
Okay, so for this question, I'm going to restructure it a little bit, because I think we have to go back to the origins and first of all highlight that this is, as I mentioned earlier, a dispute really involving the Republic of Djibouti and Dubai Ports World first and foremost. And the reason for this dispute is because, first of all, Djibouti felt like it had sold itself short on its sovereignty, because it gave the land to the Emirati consortium, which invested in building the Doraleh Container Terminal. In exchange, it got a relatively small royalty. Okay, so it made money off the port being commercially successful, but it wasn't the main kind of breadwinner from this enterprise. And it felt that the deal was not actually good enough for it, even though, in fact, the president had signed the original contract in the first place. The other contention that the Djibouti had was that once they signed the concession agreement over the Doraleh Container Terminal, which allowed the construction of the port and its operation, they had to get the written consent by Dubai Ports World if they aimed to build up any other maritime infrastructure in Djibouti. Okay, so there are actually other ports of a different nature which are built along Djibouti's coastline. But what irked the leadership in Djibouti was they had to get Dubai Ports World's written consent in order to go ahead with that. And ultimately, what will happen is that they will disregard this clause in the contract, which is going to be one of the reasons why there's all these legal disputes which will happen thereafter. Now, just to provide a bit more background context, Djibouti's been independent since 1977. Guelleh was involved in local politics roughly from around 1979 onwards. He was chief of staff for the former president Abtedon, and then he became himself president in 1997. From the 1970s onwards, he had traveled regularly to China. So he knew about China's own development trajectory, and he saw the potential to mirror and mimic that in Djibouti, but also to get China involved in Djibouti's own modernization process. So there had always been an inclination to work with the Chinese in some shape or form. So China port merchants arise into this context when there's a kind of gradually worsening relationship between Djibouti and Dubai Ports World, even though the Doraleh Container Terminal, which was opened in 2009, is commercially successful. It comes into play because, as I mentioned earlier, it bought the government's stake in that particular deal. So it's not as if China, as in the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, was the entities which were seeking the involvement of China in this ordeal. It was China port merchants who, as part of their kind of internationalization of their portfolio of port assets around the world, they're the ones who created the relationship with the Republic of Djibouti and decided to buy in to the Doraleh Container Terminal. So that's really what the dynamic which we have to understand is that first and foremost, it's a dispute between the Republic of Djibouti and Dubai Ports World. And then China Port Merchants comes into the fray. Now, Dubai Ports World is aware of this, and at first they don't seem necessarily to be opposed to China purchasing that stake, even though they never provided their written consent for this to happen, which they were supposed to, according to the legal terms of the concession agreement. It's only after the failure of the attempts by Dubai Ports World to get the Republic of Djibouti to abide by the terms of the concession agreement. So they'd been to court in the UK because that's what the concession agreement had stipulated. So they went to court in front of the High Court in the UK. They went to private chambers of arbitration in London. And every time those courts ruled in favor of Dubai Ports World, the Republic of Djibouti simply ignored the rulings and stated that they were the victims instead. So there was this kind of ongoing legal and media disputes. It's only after several failings in front of the court that then Dubai Ports World decided to take China merchants to court in Hong Kong as a change of strategy, because they felt that by doing that, this would get them, this would allow for a better chance for them to get the Republic of Djibouti to fall into line, because they would get then China Ports Merchant to pressure the Republic of Djibouti, and then as a result, the Republic of Djibouti would, want to find a kind of amicable solution to this particular conflict.
That is great. Thank you so much. So I understand that Dubai Ports is the world leading and global port operator, and it's really a big, global organization. So what's the significance of the decision to sue China's merchants?
This case highlights a number of issues. So the first thing is, in a way, it's the first time that China Port Merchants, which brings, a sizable amount of investment, is involved in numerous projects in Djibouti connecting to Ethiopia. It's probably the first time that it was kind of really being stopped in its tracks through this court case, or in any case, that there's been a kind of, in the African context at least, that its behavior has been highlighted or flagged as, potentially pernicious, not just locally, but also to prospective competitors within the infrastructure realm as well. So that's one thing that the court case did. The other thing is it highlighted, it was quite timely, because there's a correlation here between the news of the court case breaking in 2018 and the midterm elections in the US, where, according to research which has been done, notably on the role of the UAE in the States and its lobbying power in Washington, that it seems that the Emiratis were lobbying some Republican politicians, notably, quite hard at that time. And Republican politicians was using this in a way to highlight the value of President Trump's kind of stance on China. So that's where you had all this kind of acceleration of debt trap diplomacy narrative being spun by the likes of former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Senator Ted Cruz as well, all coming out and saying that, highlighting the risks of the Belt and Road Initiative. So when this court case came up, this was, if you like, it provided proof of that this entailed a certain number of risks. So the court case does highlight the fact that the BRI model has certain flaws or entails certain risks for the recipient countries, but also for potential competitors as well. So that's what it really highlighted. And the last point I said, and this is perhaps a bigger picture or helicopter view, is again coming back to the nature of South-South cooperation in the 21st century. If you look at the rhetorical, the narrative around South-South cooperation, it's always very positive. It's always about building relationships, about highlighting the role of global South countries. But then when we take the global South as a whole, of course, it's not homogenous. You have the leading members of the PAC, the BRICS countries, for example, other middle-income countries in Latin America, in West Africa, India, or the likes of Indonesia and Southeast Asia. And then you have least developed countries who have perhaps less sway, less influence, or the ones who are perhaps most in need of that cooperation in terms of their own development. So this highlights the fact that amongst the leading members of the PAC in the Global South, their interests are definitely not always aligned. And that can, in fact, end up hurting what we consider to be something relatively benign or, in fact, beneficial in South-South cooperation.
That is great. So now, if we were to look at it, Djibouti is in the Horn of Africa, and it is strategically situated in sea lanes between Asia, Europe, trade routes.
Yeah.
What are China's geopolitical intentions in expanding cover over port operations in Djibouti?
Okay, so obviously it's difficult not to think about Djibouti and then not think about it being the home of China's first overseas military base. Okay, I mentioned the Doraleh multipurpose port, which is one of the kind of standout BRI projects in East Africa. One of the keys, there are 6 keys there. One of the keys is dedicated to the People's Liberation Army Navy, so they can use that, because for the longest of time, for their anti-piracy operations, they had nowhere to dock with consistency. So that solved one of those issues. But I think it's important to distinguish again that part of China's interest in Djibouti is very much connected to its geopolitical interests, which are, again, linked to, as I said, the fight against piracy, China's involvement in peacekeeping operations in the region, or China's ability to deal with kind of crises such as having to get its citizens out of war zones, as it happened in Libya in 2011 or Yemen in 2015. So that's the official rationale behind having the base. But in terms of the dispute over the Doraleh Container Terminal, actually, there's no real connection there to China trying to assert control over it for geopolitical ends. Again, although China Port Merchants is a state-owned company and has a constitutional relationship with the Communist Party, the truth is that it behaves like a multinational. So its behavior should be seen distinctly from the interests of the Chinese government here, in that it's pursuing the aggrandizement of its portfolio for profit-making purposes, right? It wants to get access to the Doraleh Container Terminal to make money, to make more money and to have more projects. That's really its fundamental purpose. It's not doing that to get access to the Doraleh Container Terminal for security or military purposes, because in any way it wouldn't serve that purpose. So that's an important consideration. And ultimately, this is really more a reflection of what some scholars call an issue of spatial fix or social spatial restructuring, meaning that what China wants through the Doraleh Container Terminal and what China Port Merchants wants is the ability to, again, have more projects in order to make use of the excess of capital that you have in China and, exporting that to other parts of the world, exporting Chinese labor to other parts of the world, exporting Chinese material to other parts of the world. That's really the focus of the issue at hand, which is more of an economic one rather than a kind of geopolitical or geostrategic one. That being said, of course, if Chinese state-owned companies are to accumulate their access to important critical assets along Africa's east coast or into the Horn of Africa, that does give China the opportunity to exert more influence, either through economic statecraft, so by leveraging the prospect of trade or investment, or the issue of debt in order to get countries to perhaps adopt a line which is more in line with what Beijing wants for the region or internationally. And of course, there is that threat which has been highlighted notably in the US, but also amongst perhaps China's other foes, that this could potentially be used in a circumstance where, let's say, if there's outright war or conflict, that then China could mobilize some of these assets for military purposes. I am still skeptical about that because, again, if we look at the construction of ports in the Indian Ocean region, they're still very much for facilitating trade. They're not really being built for military purposes, and China is still some way off, from equating the US in terms of the number of overseas bases that it has.
Mm-hmm. That is wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. So now moving to my next question for you. How is China expanding its influence over other key ports across the globe? I understand that there is Gwadar in Pakistan, there is Haifa in Israel, and there's what they call the PHIRs in Greece.
Yeah. Okay, so this is going to be, again, similar to some of the points I've already raised. So we have to start by understanding where these ports fall into a general or generic port typology. So are they hubs? Are they maritime hubs? Are they container terminals? Or could they be used, again, for more strategic purposes in a situation which was more tense? Now, if you look at, let's start with Gwadar. Gwadar is, first of all, it's a commercial maritime port. It's an entry into Pakistan, and it links up to CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And CPEC is important as a transport node connecting China's western regions to the Indian Ocean and bypassing the Malacca Straits here in Malaysia, which has often been seen as a potential choke point where the United States Navy or others could close that trade route, and therefore that would cut China off from its main markets in West Asia, Africa, and Europe. Gwadar is also important because it's an entry point for the import of oil and gas from the Middle East, parts of Africa, for China, which is still very much dependent on the import of primary commodities. That's been controversial because, of course, there's, again, similar to Djibouti, the issue of how much debt Pakistan owes to China, whether China could then leverage that for security purposes. There has been reported sightings of kind of military or naval vessels in and around the port of Gwadar. But from my understanding up until now, that's only actually been used to protect Chinese interest in Pakistan, because CPEC's actually been quite involved a number of quite dangerous projects. Chinese engineers and laborers have been killed, sadly, in the construction of some of the projects comprising of CPEC. But that's why it's been somewhat controversial. In the case of Haifa, obviously, Israel being very close to the United States, the US Navy often using the port of Haifa, that China could use through its stake in Haifa as a mechanism to collect intelligence on the US Navy and its movements and its interests in that particular region. That was also highlighted. But from my understanding, again, it was a commercial decision first and foremost. And perhaps the best example that you brought up here is Piraeus in Greece. COSCO, which is one of the big Chinese shipping companies, bought a majority stake in a port which was pretty much on the decline. And ever since its investment in the port of Piraeus, it's been one of the most profitable ports in the world. In fact, there's a chance that it will become the busiest port in Europe, which would supersede the likes of Rotterdam and Hamburg. Now, I understand that, of course, particularly in the West, where the kind of fear of the rising of China has therefore translated in a fear of, Chinese involvement in what is considered to be critical infrastructure, especially closer to home. In this case, like the purchase of that stake in the port of Piraeus. Of course, there is, a strategic element to it which we can't deny, but we also have to see, maybe take a step back, perhaps depoliticize a little bit our analysis and try and understand, whether this has been beneficial from a purely commercial point of view or not, and what are the interests of COSCO, investing in Greece? Is it to push an agenda of the state, or is it to, again, pursue profit? And I mean, a lot of the academic literature on this disjuncture between Chinese state-owned companies doing business, notably overseas, and the geostrategic interests of the Chinese state, is that most of the literature argues, theoretically and empirically, that Chinese state-owned companies, first and foremost, are there for business purposes, and they're not necessarily paying heed to the strategic interests of the Chinese government. And a similar thing can be said for the Doraleh Disputes case study as well. So I think that's where we have to, start first and foremost, is who are the actors at play? What are their real interests? And I mean, COSCO and other Chinese shipping companies have been doing incredible business with Europe for the best part of 10, 20, 30 years. And they've built up their own relationship with local business actors in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, and elsewhere. So, we're also kind of taking for granted the fact that there's already an established business relationship in place. And sometimes, and that's the case most recently in Hamburg, the Port of Hamburg wanted investment in one of their 3 container terminals, and they reached out to COSCO because they already had a business relationship there. Now, that was blown up as the China threats taking place in Europe, but the fundamentals are that there was already a business relationship in place, and this was, in fact, just another investment. So I think it's, the issue at hand is, for the way that I see it, is that there's a tendency nowadays to associate a strong element of politicization to any Chinese investment in a critical sector. But that may not always necessarily reflect the dynamics at hand.
Wonderful, that is great. So now my very last question for you. With the United States reducing its presence in Africa, what are the policy implications of China's rising role in Africa's shipping and port development?
Okay, so what I would like to start with here is to say that, first of all, France and the United States in Djibouti allowed for foreign investment into Djibouti's maritime infrastructure, because with the French security arrangement in Djibouti allowing for stability, and with the Americans having Camp Lemonnier, this reassured foreign investors that Djibouti was a place that they could do business without there being, volatility. Because if you look around Djibouti's neighbors, you've got Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan and South Sudan aren't that far away. You've got Somalia, of course, countries which, sadly, over the best part of the last 10, 20, 30 years, sometimes even longer, have been beset by civil strife or sometimes cross-border conflict as well. And the French and American kind of military presence in Djibouti is what allowed or reassured the Emiratis at first to invest in part into the Doraleh Container Terminal. And that was the beginning of the kind of modernization of Djibouti's maritime infrastructure ecosystem. So I think we first have to say that the US and the US and France indirectly allowed for or made possible the flood of Chinese investments which would happen thereafter. So that there is, first of all, an intrinsic connection between the two. Now, I agree with you that there's going to be a general American, if not Western, disinterest in Africa because of the focus of Western foreign policy to other parts of the world, which actually allowed China to kind of re-emerge in Africa, because there was so much demand and there was so much little supply that China was able to fill that gap, and it did so quite successfully over the past 2 decades since the turn of the 21st century. Now, it's obvious that in order to bring back, or let's say to create a more level playing field, because China is the #1 trade partner for the African continent. It has been since 2009. It's the #1 trade partner to pretty much every African state. So how can the West or the US try to level that playing field? Well, obviously, if there's no drive coming from the top, from governments or a coalition of governments, then that's not going to be enough to kind of level that playing field with Chinese companies, Chinese policy banks, and what they're already doing on the African continent. And also, it's important to have a signal sent to the governments in Africa that, Western interest is there and wants to be rekindled in a way after a period of disinterest. And in fact, if you look at Djibouti, President Guelleh has been one of the most critical, I think, presidents consistently in Africa, bashing France as a former colonial power, bashing Western criticism of China's presence in Djibouti and in Africa, and simply saying, what the Emiratis and what the Chinese have been doing is what Western powers promised us to do, but never actually followed through with their promises. This is not something which is particularly new, and this is something which local leaders themselves have been flagging for the longest time. And it's not just a government-to-government issue. In fact, Guelleh had been trying to get the French private sector, to invest in Djibouti ever since he became president, and he grew very frustrated that although they made promises, in fact, they never also followed through with their promises of investment, which is where, then the likes of Djibouti started to look towards South-South cooperation as an alternative to generate investment to finance their own modernization prospects. Now, again, there's a tendency to simplify things and to kind of buy in a little bit too much into maybe the kind of anti-Western rhetoric, which is being pandered by some leaders in Africa, or the tendency for leaders like Guelleh to say, well, we're going to turn eastwards and look towards Asia instead of looking towards the West. And so then I think the counter reaction tends to be, well, okay, there's no more room for Western investment or Western development aid and so on and so forth. I think these are kind of very simplistic narratives and complete over-exaggeration. What I would say is that with the American and French kind of security contributions allowing others to bring in their own investments, and with that having allowed for the upgrading of Djibouti's maritime infrastructure, kind of generating its own momentum, I think that this is now actually becoming attractive to investments coming from Western companies. In fact, as of 2021, if I'm not mistaken, the Djibouti authorities actually cancelled a contract which they had with a Chinese company to build a second international airport. And interestingly enough, when the tender was reopened, it was awarded to a French company. So you can see how perhaps what we're now seeing is a change of mentalities, a change of the dynamics, whereby companies or investors from the West are now going back to parts of the African continent and reevaluating, their risk-taking desires. Because I think the issue was for the longest of time that these companies were not willing to take the risk. They were too focused on short-term gains, which meant that, in fact, it was more interesting for them to perhaps seek investment elsewhere. But with this kind of buildup of infrastructure, the facilitating movements of goods, merchandise, and other patterns of trade, I think suddenly this makes it more enticing to bring back investment or to reinvest there where there's been, I think, something of a dearth. And of course, it does help if Washington and Brussels and London and Tokyo are saying to their respective companies, we will subsidize your involvement in helping to consolidate or build up infrastructure in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, in other parts of the African continent. So definitely, I think that, although it seems the dynamics seem to be in China's favor in this regard, we shouldn't take it for granted that things will always remain this way. And, things do change. So I think it's all about, taking off again the kind of very strong political, if not slightly moral vision of, what's happening today on the African continent, and taking a far more pragmatic look at what's actually out there, what are the opportunities, and what synergies can exist. And although my book focuses on a dispute, the truth is that China Port Merchants actually works itself quite closely with Western companies in Africa too. One of its biggest partners is a French shipping company, which is one of the biggest shipping companies in the world. And they have been partners of China port merchants in Djibouti and elsewhere, going back several decades. So, we shouldn't also kind of always reduce this to our geopolitical lens, which, tends to, I think, sometimes misconstrue our perception of what's actually happening on the ground. The more kind of pragmatic reality is that, investors are looking for opportunities, and by building up infrastructure and facilitating ecosystems, then that's going to, I think, create more of a level playing field too.
That is wonderful. I should say thank you so much. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but I should say thank you so much to you, Dr. Benjamin Barton. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Benjamin Barton. He is an associate professor in the Department of Politics, History and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. His new book, The Doraleh Disputes Infrastructure Politics in the Global South, can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video. It was published by the Palgrave Macmillan Company and can be accessed here. Thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
That is wonderful. Right. So let me stop recording now. And